4 years ago, few expected novice party leader Justin Trudeau to win the election. He was young, inexperienced, and in third place in Parliament. No one had ever taken a party from third to first. But Canadians took a chance on a second generation of Trudeau mania. The National Post's political columnist John Ivison watched it all unfold and has had a keen eye on the PM ever since. With election 2019 now upon us, his new book reflects on the rookie PM and the issues that have come to define him. It's called Trudeau, The Education of a Prime Minister, and it brings John Ivison to our studio. Nice to have you in that chair again.
Thank you, Steve.
Let us start to tell a bit of the Justin Trudeau story here, and I want to go back, for starters, about 2 decades, and this quote from a 29-year-old Justin Trudeau, who said at the time, "I'm passionate about politics because I'm passionate about life. But this is not my direction. I don't read the newspapers. I don't watch the news. So much of politics is posturing and playing for the crowd, playing for the cameras. It's not something I feel any interest in." He certainly sounds there like he had no aspirations to be the Prime Minister of Canada. At that point, what did he want to be?
Well, somewhat ironically, though, that was in a Globe and Mail column, if I remember rightly. After his father's funeral, he was keeping himself in the public eye for some reason. At that point, it seemed he was trying to resist the kind of tractor beam of party politics. I mean, even after the funeral where he'd performed, you know, some people described it as somewhat overwrought, but it was a memorable performance and received generally good reviews. And the Liberal Party spotted him and decided we're going to try and drag him into our sphere. He resisted at that point, but I think at the back of his mind, he almost tried everything else before he got into party politics.
Yeah, he did teaching, he took a bunch of courses at university that were unrelated.
2 degrees, I think, we didn't finish. There was an activism in youth politics. But in his autobiography, he says that he found his calling when he became an MP. And I think he must have known always in the back of his mind that this is where he was going to end up. So
all things notwithstanding, you think there was an inevitability about his getting into politics?
Talking to people who knew him at the time, Seamus O'Regan, his cabinet colleague, who got to know him after the funeral, and certainly invited him to St. John's to an awards ceremony. He uses the word, there was an inevitability about it. I guess nothing's inevitable in life, and if one of these things that he tried earlier had worked out, he may not have got to where he is now, but they didn't, and he is.
And he is, yes. Well, it's interesting that when I think you're right when you say that the funeral, his father's funeral, was really the first coming out for him, real emergence on the national stage. But you also tell us in the book that it was really the boxing match that he had as a kind of a, backbench MP in the third place party against Conservative Senator Patrick Brazeau. There's the picture of the two combatants. To what extent, in your view, was this his real political birth?
Well, I think if you remember back to that time, the Liberal Party hadn't had any victories for a long time. They'd been reduced to a rump third-party status. He was deciding to emerge as, I think he pretty much made the decision to run for leader at the time. But it was a real risk. And Patrick Brazeau, I spoke to him and he said, nobody's thanked me for the fact that if Trudeau had lost, he probably would not be Prime Minister now. And there is a sense of truth to that. I mean, I think that he transformed himself in the public mind. There was always this knock on him that he was his mother's son, not his father's son, which is a bit unfair on his mother, and I think unfair on Justin Trudeau. But in doing that, this almost primeval knocking lumps out of another guy, he proved he had guts to the people who were perhaps unconvinced by him to that stage. He proved that he was a winner. He proved that he had discipline.
It wasn't just the Dauphin, as people called him.
It wasn't just the Dauphin. I mean, Brazeau said that he treated this more or less like a street fight. He came out there arms wailing, and he was a big, tough guy. Most people... I spoke to Roger Cousin, the MP, who said he was sitting in the House of Commons with Trudeau the day before, and he said, "How's it going, Justin?" And he said, "I'm going to win." And Cousin said, "I think you're going to get your lights knocked out." And
but he trained.
But he trained, and he had a trainer who he'd boxed, but he hadn't boxed at this level. And I think they displayed a whole bunch of characteristics about him that people hadn't spotted thus far.
Here's a wonderful piece of footage of Justin Trudeau and his wife, Sophie Gregoire, talking before the fight, and the camera kind of, well, it eavesdrops and catches this little exchange. Sheldon, if you would, let's play that.
I was put on this planet to do this. This is I fight and I win. It's what I'm good at. Non, mais c'est vrai, chérie. No,
You fight from the good place.
Interesting that she leans over and says, "Be humble." What do you read into that?
I had not seen that clip before, so that's very interesting. I think it's amazing the level of confidence he had in himself, when there really weren't, as far as anybody else could see, any grounds for that confidence. The "be humble" comment, I don't know. I'm trying to think what she possibly. I think that he.
Well, when he says, "I was put on this earth to do this,"
yeah, he does have a tendency to grandstand. You know, I'm sure we'll get to the India trip.
Well,
but that is a kind of a strength and a weakness. And I talk in the book about how his greatest strengths, I think, are also his greatest weaknesses. The reasons the things that got him there are as unlikely to undo him in the end as be a positive for him.
Well, we're going to pluck a little quote from the book here, which really does describe in a major way how you see this guy. Sheldon, let's bring the graphic up if we can. Trudeau sees himself in a special position as one of the anointed, cast in the role of rescuing people treated unfairly by society. While capable of contrition for aberrations committed long before he was born, he has never shown true remorse for anything he has done in office. The certainty that his path is wise and noble provides special dispensation for moral lapses. The prerogative born from a lifetime of privilege means that rules and even laws can be broken with a clear conscience. John, that is, I have to say, that's harsh. Why do you feel it's okay to write that?
Well, this idea of the vision of the anointed runs through the book, and it was an idea that came from an American thinker called Thomas Sowell, who describes the anointed and then the anointed's view of the benighted, who are not on the same moral plane as the anointed, and the opposition to the anointed are not only in error, they're in sin. And I think that is an apt description of the way that Trudeau and the people around him view their political opponents. I mean, he came onto the political scene promising to be the great unifier. But I worry that after this election, which I think at this stage, if you were forced to put money on it, you would think they're in a pretty good position to win. But I think subsequent, I would worry about the state of the country, because I think that he's not shown any dispensation towards his opponents to bring in their vision.
That is sadly a sign of the times for every leader in every jurisdiction everywhere nowadays.
I think it's true that this is a phenomenon. This polarization is something we're seeing, and the winner takes all. And you know that in some ways it goes to explain why the enthusiasm he had for electoral reform prior to the last election was lost.
Easily jettisoned.
Yeah.
Do you believe that he believes that he has some kind of God-given destiny to be the Prime Minister of this country?
I wouldn't go so far as to say God-given. I mean, I don't think he feels that it was all preordained, but I do think that he feels that his causes are so just that the ends do justify the means.
Well, you suggest here that he thinks he can sort of get away with everything and he doesn't have to apologize for anything he does. Yes, apologies for past injustices, but nothing he does. But I well remember, as do you, I'm sure, that in the midst of that old, what they called elbow gate, where he rushed across the floor of the House of Commons in order to try to get a vote to take place and inadvertently elbowed one of the New Democrat MPs, he gave a profuse apology to that, I think 2 or 3 times on the floor of the House of Commons. So why do you say what you say?
Well, I think when we're talking about, clearly elbowing a female MP, it's black and white. I think when there's shades of grey, as there are in the SNC Lavalin affair, for example, he has not been able to bring himself to apologise. We were told in March that the Prime Minister was going to come out and he was going to show contrition. Well, there was a demonstration that bordered on contrition, but then the words, "I'm sorry for what happened," never left his lips.
Maybe because he's not.
Well, I don't think he is.
Maybe because a number of Canadians think that not all that much happened there.
I don't think he is. I don't think, but I think the SNC case was overblown in some areas, but he promised he would be different. He promised he would not be the type of Prime Minister who demotes ministers who don't agree with him and overrides them.
Well, that gets to how different he is from one of his predecessors, Jean Chrétien, who famously, underpromised and overdelivered. Do you believe Trudeau is the opposite?
I do, yeah. I mean, I think the die was cast when, as a third party, they came up with this expansive platform of 260-odd promises.
Which they never thought they'd have to implement.
These were third-party promises, as was described to me. You've got promises that are going to outflank the NDP on the left in the form of electoral reform. You've got promises that are going to outflank the Conservatives on the right in the form of the Canada Child Benefit, which was much more generous than anything Harper was doing. They were liberated from the orthodoxy of balancing the books so they could spend more money. Harper's big problem was that he promised to balance the books and he had no money to spend. 100-day campaign and very little cash to blow around. So you have this massive platform, which they then compound by, when they get into power, they promise mandate letters that expand that list of promises by another 100 commitments. Clearly when you've set that level of expectation to infinity and beyond, very hard to live up to that.
Why do you feel he clearly feels a need to make big promises and set big visions? Why do you think he does that?
Well, I think that the Goethe quote that launched his leadership campaign, I think it was there's a chapter in the book called, No Dreams Are Too Small, or words to that effect. I mean, the idea is that go big or go home, and that's kind of the Trudeau persona, the Justin Trudeau persona. I mean, just to tangent off a little bit, but when he was, he played the lead role in the docudrama Papineau, where he was the First World War Anglo-Francophone hero in this dramatization. The director kept telling him to tone it down. He was overly dramatic. And I think that's his persona, is that everything needs to be toned down a little bit. He needs somebody there to say, 360 promises is probably more than we need.
Well, Stephen Harper obviously was seen as a guy with a big brain when he was the Prime Minister, but as a guy who perhaps, didn't like Canadians all that much, or certainly didn't have as much personality. Justin Trudeau is seen as the opposite, not big on policy, but lots of emotion, lots of drama, and so on. Those who accuse him of being vacuous, is that a fair accusation?
No, I don't think so. I think the most flack I've had over this book is that I describe Trudeau as intelligent. And, the Trudeau derangement syndrome kicks in and you end up getting deluged by people saying he's a moron. Well, he's not a moron. You can't be Prime Minister of this country and be a complete moron. He has an intellect. It may be different from his father's intellect or Stephen Harper's intellect. It's probably a more of an emotional intelligence. But, the idea that he's this, there's a kind of Cyrano de Bergerac effect here where he's basically reciting the words that are being whispered in his ear by Gerald Butts or whoever else. I don't buy that. I mean, it's a far more symbiotic relationship. He had certain convictions of his own before he met Butts, so you can't be Pierre Trudeau's son and not have a firm view on the Confederation or relations with Quebec.
Having said this, and I don't say this as a criticism, he has cried in public more than any Prime Minister I can ever recall. And what do you think the ramifications of that are?
Well, I think it has led to people questioning his sincerity, and I think he's overused that tactic. And sometimes...
Now, the fact that you say it's a tactic suggests that you don't believe it.
Well, I think there are certain occasions where it appeared genuine. I think the Gord Downey incident, for example, was pretty heartfelt. But, I think, it's been, in my opinion, he's brought himself to tears on a number of occasions because the empathy well that he taps seemingly endlessly has brought him results. I mean, that idea of being the anti-Harper, I mean, could you imagine Harper welling up over anything, or even his father? But this, I think in politics there's always a pendulum that swings, and he is the opposite of what preceded him, and it worked for him.
You do say here, and I got to say, I've read the book. Many people watching us right now will not have, but you're tough on him. And you
Tough to
write,
fair, Steve.
well, we'll see. We'll see. You write that while he's liked by women and young people, he is, quote, disliked in a visceral way by men. Why do you say that?
Well, I think the research suggests that older men are less likely to vote for the Conservative Party. I quote Ben Chin, one of his own advisors, who says, I remembered Justin Trudeau growing up, and my initial reaction was resentment that he got to where he is because of his famous name and his privileged upbringing. I think that is you could extrapolate from that across the country, that a lot of men who are older than him resent him.
Well, having said that, you can't win a majority government in this country if all the men in this country don't like you.
No.
So clearly lots of men like him.
But there is enough polling evidence to suggest that men are more likely not to vote for him than or certainly that when you look at the vote, the women are more likely to vote for him than men.
Okay, let's talk about whether or not you feel he deserves some credit for the way he has handled the most important foreign policy relationship we have, namely that with the United States and President Trump. He has, I think it's fair to say, kept his calm in the face of a bullying, narcissistic President of the United States, and this country has emerged with a renegotiated NAFTA and a fairly stable relationship at the moment, notwithstanding everything. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you grant him that.
Yeah. As I do in the book. I mean, I think that the trying to get a trade deal with a protectionist president was always going to be a hard thing. And I think the tactics that he employed were if not to abase himself before the Prime Minister, at least allow himself to play second fiddle. I mean, there was a body language expert who looked at the relationship and the comedy point from Trump towards Trudeau, which was suggesting that there was not a great deal of respect shown by Trump towards Trudeau. That was in their second meeting in Washington. I think Trudeau allowed that to happen. He didn't bristle at it and he didn't push back against it. For him, it was more important that the deal got done. The only time there was retaliation was when it was unavoidable, when the US put tariffs on Canada in May 2018. No, I would say that he handled that relationship pretty well, and that was reflected in the support that he got from Canadians.
Well, speaking of handling, I think you described the story in the book about how they actually rehearsed the first ever handshake that he was going to have with Trump to make sure that this bigger guy didn't sort of jerk him around as Trump frequently does with other people.
Right.
How did that go?
Well, I mean, they obviously don't want to be seen to be subservient, but so there's a level of, Canada's foreign policy can be kind of summed up as getting along with the US while maintaining your self-respect. And I think so. I think there was a level of, we're not going to be ridden roughshod over here. But at the same time, I was in the White House in this May when Trump took over. Trump's sitting there conducting.
Yes.
And Trudeau's sitting demurely next to him.
Legs crossed.
Legs together. I mean, it wasn't a submissive position, but it was a certainly subservient relationship. And I think that Trudeau has taken one for the team there.
Well, but I remember that first handshake, and the smart thing he did was put his hand on Trump's right shoulder.
Which is his modus operandi.
Yeah, to make sure that he couldn't get pulled around.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask you whether you think the SNC business, which clearly has been the most controversial part of his first term, how much you think that will have an impact on the vote coming up in October?
Well, I think it's taken the shine off Trudeau for sure, and you can see that in the some of the polling right now. There was an Angus Reid Institute poll which suggested that only 13% of Canadians have committed to re-electing the Liberals, with another 24% considering. That compares to 25% who are committed to the Conservatives. So there's an enthusiasm gap. Trudeau does not have the mania that greeted him when he came into power. So the shine is off. Having said that, I do think that it's not going to be the ballot question. People don't go into the polling booth and think, well, because of what he did on SNC, I'm not voting for them. I think that reluctantly, many people will go into the polling booth and mark their X next to the Liberals, in part because the NDP has apparently collapsed.
Well, we'll see. That's what campaigns are for, after all.
That's what campaigns are for, but at the moment, there's a poll this week that showed the NDP in 4th place, which must
Behind
be
the Greens?
behind the Bloc.
Behind the Bloc,
as far as seat count.
Oh, I see.
The seat projection. And, you know, campaigns do matter, but when you're starting that far behind, it's very hard. And this is will be a real worry for the Conservative Party, because if there's going to be a resurrection in Conservative fortunes, they need a resurrection in NDP fortunes.
What do you think the biggest lesson Justin Trudeau has learned during the course of his almost 4 years as Prime Minister so far?
I think that Canada is a hard country to govern.
You didn't know that going in?
Apparently not. I mean, I do think that this kind of vision of the anointed, where you can move pieces around the chessboard at will, their whole platform was set up. The grand bargain on pipelines and carbon tax. You know, that seemed to be a pretty good idea. The polling suggested there was support for it right across the country. That if you build a pipeline, but you could also bring in a carbon pricing. Within a year or so, the government of British Columbia falls, and you've got an NDP Green coalition, which really unravels the whole grand bargain, and it's still not been put back together again.
Okay, let me come right at you with what I know a lot of people are thinking right now, which is you're a columnist for a right-leaning newspaper, and you likely went into writing this book with, I don't want to be pejorative about this, but, you know...
Be pejorative, Steve, carry on.
Well, he probably wasn't your idea of what you'd like to see in a prime minister. His politics are probably far too far to the left for you. Is there anything you learned about him in the course of writing this book that made you like him anymore?
Yeah, I don't think I disliked him. I mean, I knew him personally before he even entered politics. He's a charming guy. I mean, there's I would say philosophically, I don't agree with that idea of moving pieces around the chessboard. I think that governing is much more complicated than that. I mean, the idea that as far back as Cicero, the idea that politics is like navigation, which I think Harper and Chrétien both understood, and sometimes you have to go with the wind and sometimes you have to tack. And, you know, people have this dogmatic view of Harper, but yet he tacked and he bought a car company.
Yes, he did.
I think Trudeau is more dogmatic than Harper in that way. He has not tacked. He hasn't gone... He's gone with the wind. He has not... He's ploughed ahead regardless of which way the wind was blowing. And I think that's led to divisions that probably didn't need to be there. But the idea that somehow I'm dogmatic and I went into it with a view that I'm going to hammer this guy, I don't think that was the case. And, and I hope it's fair. And that, you know, for example, you just mentioned the relations with the US. And I think that he did a good job at that. And he's done a good job in a whole bunch of areas.
I think one of the reasons, probably one of the reasons I came to that conclusion was that you say, I think at the back of the book in the acknowledgements or something like that, that you were thanking people who actually got you to tone this thing down because the first draft was a hell of a lot nastier than what you've ended up with.
I think I was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, thanking my wife, who's a diplomat.
But let's focus on that for a second here in our remaining moments, which is that, you know, well, I'll ask you the question. I won't say it. I'll ask you the question. Have you fallen into the trap that so many people have fallen into, which is to look at a guy who admittedly had a famous last name, who admittedly had lots of privileges in life that most Canadians don't have, and who admittedly, you know, doesn't call himself a policy wonk. His EQ is way higher than his IQ. And have you fallen into the typical trap of underestimating this guy?
I don't think I underestimate him at all. I mean, I think that I mentioned at the very end there about his campaigning abilities. I mean, we're going into a campaign. This is his strength. I mean, people were telling me, watching this guy in action, which I have done over 10, 15 years, and he enters a room and there's suddenly a crackle around the room and, you know, Justin Trudeau's in the building. You know, campaign guys saying, he sat down there with this little old lady who said, I remember you when you were 4 years old. And he said, you know, most politicians would be saying, just shoot me now. But he's loving it. I mean, he feeds off this. There was another anecdote where Michael Ignatieff had walked through a crowd of supporters and came into the green room where Justin was waiting. And Ignatieff collapsed, exhausted. And Trudeau said, you've got to feed off that crowd, which he does. I mean, this is, somebody else described him as moving like a swimmer through lake water when he's moving through a room. All of these strengths are going to stand him in good stead in the coming month or so.
When his father ran for re-election after one term of Trudeau mania, he got a minority government by 2 seats. What do you see for the son?
I think it's going to be harder than it needed to be. I mean, this should have been a slam dunk. The economy's been going relatively well. I mean, we would have criticised him if it had been going badly, so he has to get the credit for that. He's made it interesting by some of the missteps, some of the broken promises. But at the end of the day, I mean, you can only make a judgment based on what's before you right now. I think they're doing a very good job on demonising Andrew Scheer over social policies. And I think the NDP is in disarray, and that's going to mean that they do pretty well come October 21st.
Pretty well.
I would suggest a strong minority or even a majority again.
You heard it here first. We'll play the tape back after the election. See
I
how
reserve
you do.
the right to change my mind.
Change your mind after the 21st of October. It's a good read. Well done, John.
Thank you.
It's your first book, yes?
First book.
Good for you. Trudeau, The Education of a Prime Minister by John Ivison. Good of you to come to TVO tonight. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.